There are moments when everything you believe about life and death gets turned on its head. In a small Wyoming town in 1882, a young schoolteacher named Lila Carter lay dying in a wooden infirmary while 3 trained doctors stood by her bed with nothing left to offer. The fever had won. Then the door opened, and through the snow walked a man nobody expected to see, Elias Boone, the mountain hermit from Devil's Ridge. He hadn't been to town in 5 years. What he pulled from his old satchel would save her life. What he knew about the wild places would prove those doctors wrong. But why would a man who left civilization behind come back to save a stranger? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The winter of 1882 came early to the Wyoming Territory, and it came hard. Silvervale sat in a valley between 2 mountain ranges, protected from the worst winds, but not from the cold that settled in the bones of every building, every person who called this place home. It was a town of maybe 300 souls, give or take the miners who drifted through on their way to larger claims, the trappers who traded pelts twice a year, and the handful of families who'd proven stubborn enough to make something lasting out of raw timber and hard ground. Main Street ran a quarter-mile from the northern pass to the southern ridge, lined with wooden buildings that still smelled of fresh pine sap when the sun hit them right. The general store anchored one end, Hadley's sheriff office and jail the other. In between stood the saloon, the smithy, a modest church with a white steeple that could be seen from 5 miles out, and Mrs. Eleanor Gibbs's boarding house, a 2-story structure painted yellow because Eleanor said this grey country needed some brightness. The infirmary sat behind the church, a single-room building with 4 beds, a wood stove that never quite heated the corners, and windows that rattled when the wind picked up. Dr. Cornelius Marsh had run it for 12 years, ever since he'd given up a practice in St. Louis for reasons he never discussed. He was a solid man in his 50s, with grey whiskers and steady hands that had set more broken bones than he could count, and delivered enough babies to populate a small school. That school sat at the eastern edge of town, a log structure with a stone chimney and real glass windows, pride of Silvervale, built by community hands 3 years back. Miss Lila Carter taught there, and if you asked anyone in town what they valued most after their own families, half would say that schoolhouse, and the other half would say the woman who brought it to life each morning with the ringing of a brass bell. Lila had arrived on a supply wagon in the spring of 1880, stepping down into the mud with a carpet bag, 2 trunks of books, and a teaching certificate from a Boston academy. She was 24 then, slender as a willow branch, with dark hair she wore in a practical bun and eyes that seemed to take in everything without judgment. She'd answered an advertisement the town council had placed in an eastern newspaper, seeking an educated woman willing to teach in exchange for room, board, and a small salary paid in whatever the community could spare. What the advertisement hadn't mentioned was the loneliness, the brutal winters, or the fact that half the children spoke more comfort with their parents' native tongues, German, Norwegian, a bit of Irish, than with English. But Lila had taken to it like she'd been born for it. Within a month, she had 15 students of varying ages sitting in those handmade desks. Within a year, she had 23, and parents who couldn't read were learning alongside their children at the night classes she offered twice a week. She boarded at Mrs. Gibbs's place, in a small room on the 2nd floor that looked out over the valley. Eleanor Gibbs had taken to her immediately. Lila reminded her of a daughter she'd lost to cholera back in Ohio, and the 2 women had formed the kind of friendship that didn't need many words. Eleanor made sure Lila ate properly, and Lila helped Eleanor with the bookkeeping she'd always struggled with. It was a fair exchange, the kind that built the backbone of frontier communities. The fever came in late October, creeping down from a mining camp in the high country. First it took a prospector nobody knew by name, then a family of 4 who'd been passing through. Dr. Marsh recognized it as mountain fever, a virulent strain that hit hard and fast, burning through the body until it either broke or took you with it. He'd seen it twice before, both times with tragic results. By early November, 11 people in Silvervale had fallen ill. Marsh sent word to Casper, asking for assistance, and 2 doctors arrived within the week. Dr. Wilhelm Brenner came first, a German physician with impressive credentials from Heidelberg and a manner that suggested he'd never quite forgiven the frontier for not being more civilized. He was tall, precise, and carried a medical bag that cost more than most families earned in 6 months. Dr. Samuel Hayes arrived 3 days later, a young man barely past his licensing, eager and earnest and wanting desperately to prove himself capable. He'd apprenticed in Chicago and had that Eastern confidence that hadn't yet been weathered by the reality of limited supplies, impossible distances, and patients who sometimes chose prayer over treatment. Together, the 3 doctors worked around the clock. They administered quinine, applied cold compresses, monitored vitals, and did everything their training had taught them. They saved 6 of the 11. The other 5 were buried in the churchyard on the hill, where the wind sang through the grass and you could see clear to the mountains. Lila fell ill on November 7th, a Tuesday that had started with her ringing the school bell as usual. By noon, she'd sent the children home early, apologizing for a headache. By evening, Eleanor found her collapsed in her room, burning with fever, her skin dry as parchment. Dr. Marsh came immediately. One look at her flushed face and rapid pulse told him everything he needed to know. He'd hoped the fever had run its course through the valley, but here it was again, and this time it had taken someone the whole town loved. For 5 days, Lila lingered in that infirmary bed while 3 learned men did everything within their power to save her. They monitored her temperature. It climbed to 104 and stayed there. They tried every remedy in their combined experience: willow bark tea, cold baths, bloodletting when her pulse grew too rapid, laudanum when the pain made her cry out in her sleep. Nothing worked. By the 5th day, her breathing had grown shallow. Her pulse weakened to something barely perceptible beneath Marsh's fingers. The flush had left her cheeks, replaced by a greyish pallor that every doctor recognized. Dr. Brenner, in his clipped accent, said what the others were thinking: "There is nothing more to be done. We have exhausted all options." Dr. Hayes, young enough to still feel each loss personally, turned away to hide his face. Dr. Marsh simply sat by her bedside, holding her limp hand. Feeling the weight of his inadequacy settle over him like a burial shroud, Reverend Augustus Pine was summoned. He came with his Bible and his solemn expression, ready to offer last rites. The word spread through town the way bad news always does, quick and quiet, leaving a wake of grief. By late afternoon, 24 townspeople had gathered outside the infirmary. Eleanor Gibbs sat on the steps, her face buried in her apron. Sheriff Tom Hadley stood nearby, hat in his hands, looking older than his 48 years. The children Lila taught clustered together, some crying openly, others too stunned for tears. Inside, the 3 doctors stood back from the bed, giving the Reverend room to perform his sacred duty. The oil lamps cast long shadows across the wooden floor. The wood stove crackled softly. Lila's breathing came in faint, irregular gasps that seemed to mark time running out. That's when the door opened. Cold air rushed in, carrying with it a swirl of snow and the scent of pine and wood smoke. Every head turned. The man who stood in the doorway was tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders that filled the frame. He wore a heavy coat made of elk hide, patched and weathered by years of mountain use. His beard was thick and dark, touched with grey, and his hair hung past his collar. His face was weathered like old leather, lined by wind and sun, and the kind of solitude that changes a man's features. But his eyes were clear and sharp, the pale blue of high-altitude ice, and they swept the room with an intensity that made everyone present fall silent. He carried a worn leather satchel over one shoulder. Sheriff Hadley was the first to find his voice. "Elias?" The man, Elias Boone, nodded once. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, shutting out the cold and the curious crowd that had begun to gather. His gaze went straight to the bed where Lila lay dying, and something flickered across his face. Recognition, perhaps. or memory. Dr. Marsh stood. This is a sick room. Unless you have business here, I'll have to ask you to— I have business, Elias said. His voice was low and rough from disuse, but there was no hesitation in it. He crossed to the bed in 3 long strides, set his satchel on the floor, and knelt beside Lila, with a grace that suggested this wasn't the first time he'd attended a patient. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, one to her wrist, finding the pulse point, the other to her forehead. He leaned close, listening to her breathing, studying the color of her skin, the dryness of her lips, the faint tremor in her limbs. "How long has she been like this?" he asked. 5 days, Dr. Marsh said, his tone caught between indignation and curiosity. "And who exactly are you to be examining?" "Elias Boone," Sheriff Hadley said quietly. "Used to be a doctor. Long time ago." Every person in that room turned to look at the sheriff, then back at the mountain man, kneeling by the dying schoolteacher's bed. Elias didn't look up. His attention remained fixed on Lila, his fingers now gently pressing along her neck, checking the lymph nodes. "What treatment have you given her?" Dr. Brenner scoffed. "We have administered every appropriate remedy available to modern medicine. Quinine, cold compresses, willow bark extract. For influenza?" Elias asked. "The fever has all the hallmarks. It's not influenza." Elias finally looked up, his pale eyes moving from Brenner to Marsh to young Hayes. "It's mountain fever. Different strain, different treatment needed." Dr. Marsh frowned. "We considered that, but the symptoms lie," Elias said flatly. He reached for his satchel and began unbuckling the straps. "Your treatment's probably made her worse. Quinine's good for malaria, useless for this. Cold baths lower the fever but shock the system when it's already failing." "That is preposterous," Dr. Brenner snapped. "I have practiced medicine for 20 years in some of the finest." "Then you should know better." Elias pulled out a small glass vial filled with amber liquid that caught the lamplight and glowed like captured sunlight. "This is what she needs." The 3 doctors stared at the vial. Dr. Marsh spoke first, his voice careful. "What is that?" "Medicine," Elias said simply. He uncorked it, and a sharp, clean scent filled the room, something like pine and mint and earth after rain. "Primitive nonsense," Dr. Brenner muttered. "You cannot seriously expect us to allow some wilderness concoction." Elias's gaze snapped to him, cold and hard. "You've had your chance. Now let the mountains speak." The words hung in the air. No one moved. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Inside, Lila's breathing hitched, stuttered, and for one terrible moment seemed to stop altogether. Eleanor Gibbs pushed past the Reverend and into the room. "Give it to her," she said, her voice breaking. "Whatever it is, give it to her. Nothing else has worked." Dr. Marsh looked at the vial, at Elias, at Lila's grey face. He'd taken an oath to do no harm, but he'd also taken an oath to heal, and right now healing seemed beyond his reach. Finally, slowly, he stepped back. "Go ahead," he said quietly. Elias turned back to Lila. With surprising gentleness, he lifted her head and tilted the vial to her lips. 3 drops. That was all. 3 drops of golden liquid that slipped past her pale lips and disappeared. Then he lowered her head back to the pillow, corked the vial, and settled in to wait. The room held its breath. Minutes passed like hours. The oil lamps flickered. The stove popped. Somewhere outside, a dog barked, and a child's voice called out something indistinct, and then so subtle at first that no one was certain they'd seen it. Color. The faintest hint of pink creeping back into Lila's cheeks. Her chest rose with a deeper breath, then another. Her eyelids fluttered but didn't open. Dr. Hayes let out a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. Dr. Marsh leaned forward, his medical training taking over, reaching for her wrist to check her pulse. It was there, stronger now, more steady. "My God," he whispered. Elias Boone stood, shouldering his satchel. He didn't smile, didn't acknowledge the miracle that had just occurred under his hands. He simply headed for the door. "Wait," Sheriff Hadley said. "Elias, wait." But the mountain man was already gone. Stepping out into the snow and the gathering dark, leaving behind only the faint scent of pine and the sound of a woman breathing steadily where moments before there had been only the approach of death. Sheriff Tom Hadley caught up with Elias halfway down Main Street. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes that swirled in the wind and caught in beards and eyelashes. Elias walked with his head down, his long strides eating up the distance between the infirmary and the edge of town, where the road gave way to wilderness. Elias. "Hold up," Hadley called, his breath coming out in white clouds. The mountain man stopped, but didn't turn around. Hadley came up beside him. Both men standing in the middle of the street, while snow accumulated on their shoulders. "That was quite something back there," Hadley said. "She'll need another dose at dawn," Elias replied, his eyes fixed on the dark mountains to the west. "And one more at sunset tomorrow. After that, she should be through the worst of it. Will you be the one to give it to her?" Elias was quiet for a long moment. "I'll leave the vials with Marsh. He's a good doctor. He'll manage. You planning to disappear back up to Devil's Ridge?" "That's where I live." Hadley studied the man beside him. It had been 5 years since Elias Boone had last walked these streets, and even then it had only been to trade pelts for supplies before vanishing back into the high country. Before that was a different man entirely. Hadley remembered that man, the one who'd arrived in Wyoming Territory in 1869. Fresh from the east with grief carved into his face and medical training he no longer trusted. "You saved her life," Hadley said. "The whole town will want to thank you." "Don't need thanks, maybe not. But they need to give them." Hadley shifted his weight, his sheriff's instincts reading the tension in Elias's shoulders. "Stay one night at least. Eleanor will have your head if you leave without letting her feed you proper." Elias almost smiled. Almost. "Eleanor Gibbs is a force of nature. That she is." Hadley paused. "Look, I know you prefer your solitude, but one night won't kill you, and it might do you some good to remember there's still people in this world worth knowing." The snow fell between them. Somewhere back toward the infirmary, voices rose in celebration as word of Lila's improvement spread. Elias heard them, and something in his expression tightened. A man bracing against something that hurt worse than cold. "One night," he finally said. "Then I'm gone." Eleanor Gibbs had the guest room ready before Elias even reached the boarding house. She'd heated water for a bath, laid out clean clothes that had belonged to her late husband, and prepared a meal that would have fed 3 men, pot roast with potatoes and carrots, fresh bread with butter, apple pie made from the last of the autumn harvest. When Elias came through the door, she took one look at him and burst into tears. Then she pulled him into an embrace that would have crushed a smaller man, thanking him in broken sentences while he stood awkward and uncertain, his arms eventually coming up to pat her back with the hesitant touch of someone who'd forgotten how human comfort worked. "That girl is like a daughter to me," Eleanor said when she finally released him. "What you did, there aren't words. Just medicine," Elias said quietly. "It was more than that, and you know it." She ushered him toward the dining room. "Now sit down and eat before it gets cold. I won't hear any arguments." He ate in silence while she bustled around him, refilling his plate before he'd finished the first helping, pouring coffee that was strong enough to strip paint. Other boarders came and went, a surveyor, a pair of miners, a traveling salesman, each one stopping to stare at the legendary hermit of Devil's Ridge sitting at Eleanor's table like a regular human being. After the meal, Elias excused himself to the guest room. It was small but clean, with a real bed, cotton sheets and a window that looked out over the dark valley. He set his satchel on a chair and stood for a long time just looking at that bed, remembering the last time he'd slept in one. 3 years, 4. Up on the ridge, he had a cot made of pine poles and elk hide. It was sufficient. This bed looked soft enough to drown in. He didn't sleep, though. Instead, he sat on the edge of the mattress and opened his satchel, pulling out a leather-bound journal that was thick with pressed plants, sketches and notes written in a hand that had grown less steady over the years. He turned to a page dated 1873 and ran his fingers over the words written there. The handwriting was different on this page, bolder, more certain. not his writing. Below it, a sketch of a plant with serrated leaves and small white flowers. Beside the sketch, a single word in another language, Shoshone. Elias closed his eyes and let himself remember. It had been autumn 9 years ago. He'd been living in a rough cabin further north, trading with trappers occasionally, but mostly keeping to himself, trying to forget everything Philadelphia had been. He'd gone higher into the mountains than usual, following a creek that led to alpine meadows where elk gathered before the first snow. That's where he'd found White Owl, collapsed beside a boulder with a broken leg and 3 days without water. The old Shoshone healer had been gathering herbs when he'd fallen, and by the time Elias found him, infection had set in deep. Elias had carried him back to the cabin, no small feat given the man's dead weight and the rough terrain. He'd set the leg, cleaned the wound, administered what medicines he had. For 3 days, White Owl had burned with fever, delirious and speaking in his native tongue. Elias had stayed with him, changing compresses, forcing water between cracked lips, falling back into the rhythms of doctoring that he'd sworn he'd left behind. On the 4th day, the fever broke. White Owl had opened his eyes, studied Elias with an intensity that seemed to see straight through flesh to bone, and said in perfect English, "You have the hands of a healer, but the heart of a man running from ghosts." They talked then, in the way that strangers sometimes do when circumstances strip away the usual pretenses. Elias told him about Catherine, about Rose, about the scarlet fever that had taken them both, despite everything he'd learned, everything he'd tried, about the rage he'd felt at medicine's limitations, at God's silence, at his own inadequacy. White Owl had listened without judgment. Then he'd said, "Your people put all their faith in what can be measured and explained, but the earth has wisdom that doesn't fit in your books. If you want to truly heal, you must learn to listen to what the land teaches." Elias had been skeptical. He was a man of science, trained in anatomy and pharmacology, not superstition. But White Owl had proven persuasive, not through argument, but through demonstration. Over the months of his recovery, he taught Elias about the plants that grew in the high country, the ones that held genuine medicinal properties, how to identify them by season, how to harvest without depleting, how to prepare tinctures and salves that worked not through magic but through chemistry that simply hadn't been catalogued in any medical text Elias had ever read. The golden liquid that had saved Lila came from White Owl's teaching, a combination of Rocky Mountain bee plant, alpine yarrow, and the bark of high-altitude willow, prepared in a specific way during the autumn equinox and aged for exactly 1 year. White Owl had called it the fever cure, said it worked on illnesses that regular medicine couldn't touch. Elias had been doubtful until he'd tried it on a trapper who'd contracted mountain fever during a particularly brutal winter. The man had been 3 days from death when Elias found him. 3 drops of the tincture administered over 2 days, and he'd recovered completely. White Owl had died the following spring peacefully in his sleep. He'd left Elias his medicine pouch, his journal of plant sketches, and a final piece of advice. Hiding from grief is not the same as healing from it. Someday you'll have to choose which one you want. Elias opened his eyes, back in Eleanor's guest room, the journal heavy in his hands. He'd kept running from that choice for 9 years, kept himself isolated on Devil's Ridge, gathering herbs and living like a ghost, helping the occasional injured animal or lost traveler, but never staying long enough to form connections that might crack open the carefully maintained walls around his heart. Then, tonight, he'd walked into that infirmary and seen Lila Carter dying, and something in him had broken loose. Or maybe it had been trying to break loose for years and had finally found a crack wide enough. He closed the journal and tucked it back into his satchel. Tomorrow, he'd leave the remaining vials with Dr. Marsh, give instructions for Lila's continued care, and return to his mountain. That was the plan. It was a good plan, sensible, so why did it feel like running? A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Boone?" a voice called. Young, uncertain. "It's Dr. Hayes. May I speak with you?" Elias opened the door. The young doctor stood in the hallway, still wearing his vest and shirt sleeves, his hair disheveled like he'd been running his hands through it. His eyes were bright with something between excitement and desperation. "She's awake," Hayes said. "Miss Carter. She's asking for you. I left instructions with Dr. Marsh. She wants to thank you herself. Please." Hayes shifted his weight. "And I'd like to understand what you did. That medicine you gave her, I've never seen anything work that fast. It's not something you'd find in a medical journal. I don't care where it comes from if it saves lives." Hayes met his gaze directly. "I became a doctor to help people. If there are treatments I don't know about, treatments that work, I want to learn them. Will you teach me?" Elias studied the young man. He saw himself in that earnest face, the version of himself that had existed before grief had carved away everything soft and hopeful. Part of him wanted to slam the door, pack his things and leave before dawn. But another part, a part he'd thought long dead, stirred with something that felt dangerously like purpose. "I'll talk to her," Elias said finally. "Then we'll see." The infirmary was quieter now. The crowd dispersed, leaving only Dr. Marsh keeping watch and Eleanor Gibbs sitting in a chair beside Lila's bed. The lamplight was softer, turned down low, and someone had stoked the stove until the room felt almost warm. Lila was propped up on pillows, her color vastly improved from the grey pallor of hours before. She was still weak. That was obvious in the careful way she held herself, the tremor in her hands, but her eyes were clear and focused. When Elias entered, those eyes found him immediately. "You're the one who saved me," she said. Her voice was hoarse but steady. "I gave you medicine. Your body did the saving." A small smile touched her lips. "Mrs. Gibbs says you're the hermit from Devil's Ridge, says you haven't been to town in 5 years. That's about right. Then why come tonight?" It was a fair question, one Elias had been asking himself. He thought about lying, giving some practical answer about hearing of the fever outbreak, about having medicine that might help. But something in Lila's direct gaze made dishonesty feel impossible. "I don't know," he admitted. "Saw the smoke from the chimneys, knew something was wrong, thought maybe I could help." "Well, you did." She shifted slightly, wincing. "Mrs. Gibbs tells me you used to be a doctor. A real one, trained back east, long time ago. But you remember how? You don't forget something like that." Lila was quiet for a moment, studying him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "I'm a teacher," she said finally. "And one thing I've learned about teaching is that knowledge unused becomes knowledge lost. You've been hiding your skills up on that mountain. I've had my reasons. I'm sure you have." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But there are 3 more people in this town, sick with the same fever I had. Mrs. Brennan and her 2 children. Dr. Marsh and the others are treating them. But they're using the wrong treatments," Elias finished. "Will you help them?" It wasn't really a question, more a gentle challenge. "Or are your reasons for hiding more important than their lives?" Eleanor Gibbs made a soft sound of approval. Dr. Marsh, standing near the stove, watched Elias with careful neutrality. Elias felt the walls he'd built threatening to collapse. 3 more people. The Brennan family, he remembered them vaguely, homesteaders who'd arrived a few years back. 2 children meant 2 lives barely started. 2 futures that might end before they truly began. He thought about White Owl's last words. "Someday you'll have to choose." 3 days. Elias heard himself say. "I'll stay 3 days, treat them, teach your doctors what they need to know. Then I go back to the ridge." Lila's smile was small but genuine. "Thank you." As Elias turned to leave, Dr. Hayes fell into step beside him, already pulling out a notebook and asking questions about the medicine, the preparation, the dosage. Dr. Marsh followed, his earlier skepticism replaced by professional curiosity. Even Reverend Pine, still present in the corner, offered a grateful nod. Elias walked out into the night, with 3 men following him, asking questions, seeking knowledge. Behind him, in the warm infirmary, Lila Carter watched him go, and Eleanor Gibbs squeezed her hand. "That man has been running from something for a long time," Eleanor whispered. "Yes," Lila agreed, her voice soft. "But I think he just stopped. The snow had let up, leaving the world crystalline and quiet. Elias stood in the street, looking up at the mountains where his cabin waited, dark and empty. 3 days, he told himself, then back to solitude. But deep down, in a place he'd tried hard to bury, he suspected those 3 days might change everything. That evening, Sheriff Hadley called a town meeting at the church. Nearly 100 people crowded into the wooden pews, their faces showing concern tempered with the stoic pragmatism of frontier folk who'd weathered troubles before. Reverend Pine opened with a brief prayer, then Hadley stood at the pulpit and laid out the situation. "The Crowley gang has been spotted in our territory," he said without preamble. "They're outlaws, 5 or 6 men, all armed, all dangerous. They've been living off robbery and intimidation for the past year. Most recently, they hit a stagecoach near Casper, killed the driver, took everything of value." Murmurs rippled through the congregation. Hadley raised his hand for quiet. "Now, I don't want to cause panic. They might pass us by entirely. But if they don't, if they decide Silvervale looks like an easy target, we need to be ready." "What kind of ready?" "Someone called from the back, organized, armed, prepared to defend what's ours." Hadley looked around the room. "I'll be deputizing volunteers, setting up watches, making sure we have defensible positions. This isn't the first time this town has faced trouble, and it won't be the last. But we face it together." Elias sat in the back pew watching. He'd tried to stay out of the meeting, but Eleanor had practically dragged him there, insisting that his military experience made him valuable. Now, as the discussion turned to tactics and defenses, he felt people's eyes turning toward him. "Mr. Boone," Hadley called out, "you served in the war. What's your assessment?" Elias stood reluctantly. Every face in the church turned to look at him, the mysterious hermit who'd saved their schoolteacher, who'd healed the Brennan children, who'd lived as a ghost for 5 years and suddenly materialized when they needed him most. "The town's vulnerable," he said plainly. "Main Street's too exposed. The buildings aren't fortified. If they hit us hard and fast, they could do serious damage before we organize a response. So what do we do?" This from a homesteader Elias recognized vaguely, a man with 3 young children. "Create strong points. Barricade the street entrances. Station armed men at the church, the boarding house, the general store, buildings with good sight lines and thick walls. Evacuate the women and children to a central location that's defensible." Elias's voice was steady, military training reasserting itself. "And we need scouts watching the approaches. If they come, we need warning." The discussion continued for another hour. Volunteers were organized into shifts. Weapons were inventoried, more hunting rifles and shotguns than Elias would have liked, but enough to mount a defense. Plans were made for evacuating the vulnerable. Through it all, Elias found himself drawn deeper into the leadership role, answering questions, suggesting strategies, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like an old, familiar coat. After the meeting, as people filed out into the cold night, Lila approached him. She'd insisted on attending despite still being weak from her illness, wrapped in a heavy shawl Eleanor had lent her. "You're good at this," she said, "leading people. I was a field medic in the war. You learn to organize quickly or people die. It's more than that. People trust you." She pulled the shawl tighter against the wind. "They see something in you that maybe you don't see in yourself. And what's that? Someone who cares. Someone worth following." She paused. "Will you show me the school tomorrow? I know I asked before, but with everything happening, I want to make sure it's ready. The children have already missed too much time." Elias studied her face in the lamplight spilling from the church. There was determination there and something else, a quiet strength that reminded him of Catherine. Not in appearance, but in that core of steel wrapped in gentleness. "You should be resting. I've rested for 5 days. Any more and I'll go mad," she smiled. "Please?" "It would mean a great deal to me." He couldn't say no to that smile. "Tomorrow morning, then." They walked back toward the boarding house together, their breath steaming in the cold air. The street was quiet, except for the sound of their footsteps and the distant bark of a dog. Above them, stars burned with the fierce clarity that only came in mountain country, away from the smoke and lights of cities. "Can I ask you something personal?" Leela said after a while. "You can ask. Can't promise I'll answer. Sheriff Hadley mentioned you lost your family. Your wife and daughter." Elias's jaw tightened, but he didn't stop walking. "That's not a question. No, the question is, does it get easier? The grief." He was quiet for a long moment, weighing whether to answer, whether to let her into the carefully guarded territory of his past. But something about the darkness, the stars, the sense that time was running short made him honest. "No," he said finally. "It doesn't get easier. It gets different. The sharp edges dull down to a constant ache. You learn to carry it, to build your life around it instead of letting it crush you. But it never goes away." "I lost my brother," Lila said softly. 3 years ago, consumption. I was with him at the end, watching him waste away, unable to help." Her voice caught. "That's why I came west. I couldn't stay in Boston. Couldn't walk past the places we'd been together. Couldn't face the pity in everyone's eyes. So you ran too." "Yes, but I think maybe I ran toward something instead of just away. I found purpose here, teaching these children, being part of something larger than my grief." She stopped walking, turned to face him. "You could do the same, you know, if you chose to. Leela, I'm not asking you to stay forever. I'm not asking you to forget what you lost or pretend the pain isn't real." Her eyes were earnest in the starlight. "I'm just asking you to consider that maybe, just maybe, there's more to life than surviving alone on a mountain." Before he could respond, a commotion erupted from the direction of the infirmary. Voices raised in alarm, the sound of rapid footsteps. Dr. Marsh appeared, running toward them, his medical bag bouncing against his hip. "Elias! It's the Brennan boy, Thomas. He's taken a turn. His mother sent someone to fetch me, but—" Marsh was breathing hard. "I don't know what to do. The fever's back, worse than before." Elias was already moving, his long strides eating up the distance to where the horses were stabled. "Get the emergency kit from my satchel at the boarding house," he called to Lila. "The small leather pouch with the red stitching. Bring it to the Brennan place as fast as you can." He was mounted and riding before Marsh could catch his breath, pushing the horse to dangerous speeds on the dark road. His mind raced through possibilities. Relapse was rare with mountain fever once the tincture took hold, but not impossible. Had he miscalculated the dosage? Missed some underlying complication? Used herbs that had lost their potency? The Brennan cabin appeared in the darkness, lamplight spilling from the windows. Elias dismounted at a run and burst through the door. Mrs. Brennan knelt beside the bed where Thomas lay, his small body convulsing with fever, his skin burning to the touch. Mary sat in a corner, recovered enough to be terrified, her eyes huge and wet with tears. "He was fine this afternoon," Mrs. Brennan sobbed. "Eating, talking, playing with his sister. Then an hour ago, he just—" Elias placed his hands on Thomas's chest, feeling the racing heartbeat, the labored breathing. His trained eyes took in every detail. The rash spreading across the boy's torso that hadn't been there this morning, the slight swelling around his neck, the way his fingers were tinged blue at the tips. This wasn't mountain fever. This was something else entirely. "When did the rash appear?" Elias demanded. "Just after sunset." "Why, what's wrong?" Elias's mind worked frantically, pulling from the depths of his medical training, searching for diagnoses that fit these symptoms. The rash, the sudden relapse, the respiratory distress, scarlet fever, the same disease that had killed Catherine and Rose, the same disease he'd been powerless to stop. His hands began to shake. The room tilted. For a moment, he wasn't in a Wyoming cabin in 1882. He was in a Philadelphia bedroom in 1868, watching his daughter die, while his medical books lay useless on the floor and his wife wept in the corner. Elias. Dr. Marsh's voice cut through the panic. The old doctor had arrived, was gripping Elias's shoulder hard. "Breathe. Focus. That boy needs you here now, not lost in the past." Elias forced air into his lungs, forced his hands to steady, forced himself back to the present, to this child who was still alive, still fighting. "It's scarlet fever," he said, his voice rough but controlled. "Secondary infection, probably contracted while his system was weakened by the mountain fever. Can you treat it?" Mrs. Brennan's voice was desperate. Elias looked at Thomas's small, fevered face, looked at Mary watching from the corner, looked at this mother who'd already lost so much and stood to lose so much more. He thought about White Owl's teachings, about the herbs he'd gathered that very day, about combinations he'd never tried because the memory of his failure with Catherine and Rose had been too raw, too paralyzing. "I can try," he said, and for the first time in 14 years, he let himself believe it might be enough. Elias worked through the night. He sent Dr. Marsh back to town for specific supplies: honey, vinegar, clean cotton cloth. He brewed a tea from the fresh herbs he'd gathered, combining them in ratios that came from intuition as much as knowledge. White Owl had taught him that healing sometimes required trusting your instincts, listening to what the patient's body was telling you rather than following rigid protocols. Thomas's fever was stubborn, clinging like a demon determined not to be cast out. Elias applied cool compresses, administered the herbal tea in small, frequent doses, monitored every change in breathing and heart rate. Mrs. Brennan hovered nearby, her hands twisted in her apron, praying under her breath in German. Around midnight, Leela arrived with the emergency kit. Her face was pale from exertion. She'd pushed herself too hard, still recovering, but her eyes were determined. She set down the kit and immediately began helping without being asked. Heating water, preparing fresh compresses, keeping Mary calm and occupied in the corner. "You should be resting," Elias said without looking up from Thomas. "So should you." She wrung out a cloth and handed it to him. "But here we both are." They worked in tandem, falling into an easy rhythm. Lila seemed to anticipate what he needed before he asked for it, and her presence brought a calmness to the room that even Mrs. Brennan responded to. At one point, when Thomas's breathing grew particularly labored, Lila began singing a soft, wordless melody that filled the cabin with something like peace. "My mother used to sing that," Elias said quietly. "When I was sick as a child." "Mine too." Lila's hands never stopped moving, smoothing Thomas's hair back from his forehead. "Some songs are older than any of us. They carry comfort in the notes themselves." By 3 in the morning, the fever finally broke. Thomas's breathing eased, and the rash began to fade from angry red to pale pink. He opened his eyes briefly, confused and frightened, but Elias's gentle voice and his mother's tears of relief soothed him back into genuine sleep. Elias sat back on his heels, exhausted. His hands were shaking again, but this time from fatigue rather than fear. He'd done it. He'd faced the disease that had haunted him for 14 years, and this time he'd won. "You saved him," Mrs. Brennan whispered. "Thank God you saved him. The crisis has passed," Elias said carefully. "But he'll need watching for the next few days. The fever could return. If it does, I'll send for you immediately." She gripped his hand with surprising strength. "You're a miracle worker, Mr. Boone, a true blessing from God." Elias didn't feel like a miracle worker. He felt like a man who'd been given an unexpected second chance and somehow, against all odds, hadn't wasted it. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten in the east. Lila stood on the porch, wrapped in her shawl, watching the dawn. Elias joined her, his body aching from hours bent over the sickbed. "Thank you," he said, "for helping tonight. You did the hard part. I just supported you." She glanced at him, and in the growing light, he could see the understanding in her eyes. "It was scarlet fever, wasn't it? The disease that took your family." He nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in his throat. "And you treated it anyway. Faced your worst fear and didn't let it stop you." Her voice was soft but firm. "That's not just medicine, Elias. That's courage." They stood in silence as the sun climbed higher, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber. Somewhere in town, the school bell would be ringing soon, the brass bell Lila had promised to show him. Life continuing, steady and persistent, despite illness and threat and loss. "I'd like to see that school now," Elias said, "if you're still willing to show me." Lila's smile was like the sunrise, gradual and warm and full of promise. "I'd like that very much." They rode back to Silvervale, slowly, giving the horses their head, in no hurry despite their exhaustion. The town was beginning to stir, smoke from chimneys, the clang of the smithy's hammer, voices calling morning greetings. It struck Elias how alive this place was, how interconnected, so different from his solitary cabin where the only sounds were wind and wildlife and his own thoughts. The schoolhouse sat at the eastern edge of town, built from pine logs chinked with mud and moss. It had 4 windows, real glass, not just oiled paper, and a stone chimney that spoke of careful craftsmanship. The door was painted red, a splash of color against the weathered wood. Lila produced a key and let them inside. The single room was simple but welcoming. Rows of handmade desks sized for different ages, a slate board on the front wall, shelves lined with McGuffey readers and arithmetic primers. Children's drawings covered one wall, crude but charming attempts at landscapes. Animals, family portraits. "I have 26 students," Lila said, moving through the room with obvious affection, straightening a desk here, retrieving a dropped pencil there. Ages 6 to 15. Some can barely read when they start. Others are sharp as tacks, but lack any formal education. I try to meet each one where they are. Elias watched her ring the brass bell that hung by the door, the one that announced the start of each school day. The sound was clear and bright, carrying across the valley, a daily promise that learning and growth continued despite hardship. "My daughter would have loved this," he said, surprising himself with the confession. Rose. She was only 4 when she died, but she was already fascinated by letters and numbers. "She used to sit in my study, pretending to read my medical journals. Tell me about her." So he did. Standing in that schoolhouse with dawn light streaming through the windows, Elias talked about Rose, her laugh, her curiosity, the way she'd insisted on helping him tend to patients, even though she barely reached his knee. He talked about Catherine, how she'd supported his work, how they'd dreamed of the life they'd build together, and Lila listened without judgment or pity, just quiet understanding. When he finished, she said simply, "They would have been proud of what you did tonight. Saving Thomas, facing your fear. I should have been able to save them too. You were human then, and you're human now. Medicine isn't magic, Elias. Sometimes people die despite our best efforts. That doesn't make you a failure. It makes you someone who dared to try." She moved closer, her voice gentle. "And it means that when you do save someone, like Lila, like the Brennan children, like Thomas tonight, it matters even more." Elias looked around the schoolroom, at the small desks waiting for children to return, at the lessons written on the slate board, at the evidence of Lila's dedication and care. This was what White Owl had meant about healing. It wasn't just about curing disease. It was about creating spaces where life could flourish, where knowledge could be passed on, where hope could take root and grow. 3 days, he said. "That's what I agreed to. But, Lila's eyes were hopeful. "Maybe I could stay a bit longer. Just until the threat of the Crowley gang passes. Until we're sure the fever outbreak is truly over." He met her gaze. "Would that be acceptable?" Her smile was answer enough, but she said it anyway. "More than acceptable." It would be a gift. As they left the schoolhouse, Elias looked back one more time. In his mind, he could almost see Rose sitting at one of those desks, her small face scrunched in concentration as she practiced her letters. The image hurt, but it was a sweet hurt, like pressing on a healing bruise. Maybe, he thought, that's what healing really was. Not forgetting the pain, but learning to carry it while still moving forward, learning to live again, even when you thought you'd forgotten how. 2 days passed in relative peace. Thomas Brennan continued his recovery, strong enough to sit up and demand food, to Mary's delighted relief. Lila regained her strength, though Elias insisted she take it slowly. The town prepared for the possibility of the Crowley gang's arrival. Barricades were constructed, watches were set, weapons were cleaned and loaded. Dr. Wilhelm Brenner returned from Cheyenne on the afternoon of the 2nd day, driving a wagon loaded with medical supplies. He seemed agitated, distracted, barely acknowledging the greetings from townspeople as he directed the unloading of crates at the infirmary. Elias was at the boarding house, updating his medical journal with notes on Thomas's treatment. When Sheriff Hadley knocked on his door, "Got a minute?" Hadley's expression was troubled. "What's wrong?" "Maybe nothing. Maybe something." Hadley stepped inside and closed the door. "Dr. Brenner's been acting strange since he got back. Nervous. Keeps looking over his shoulder. And some of the things he brought back in those crates, they're not just medical supplies." "What do you mean?" "Mining equipment. Surveying tools. Documents with the Consolidated Western Mining Company letterhead." Hadley pulled out a folded paper from his jacket. "Found this on the ground near his wagon. Looks like it fell out when he was unloading." Elias took the paper and unfolded it. It was a letter dated 3 weeks earlier, addressed to Dr. Wilhelm Brenner from a company official in Cheyenne. The language was formal, but the meaning was clear. Brenner was being paid to assess the medical viability of Silvervale, to report on the health of the population, and to provide recommendations on whether the settlement was stable enough to warrant investment or vulnerable enough to encourage abandonment. "He's been spying for a mining company?" Elias looked up at Hadley. "Looks that way. Question is why? What does a mining company care about a little valley town?" Elias thought back to his conversations with White Owl, to things the old healer had mentioned about the mountains. Silver. There are rumors of silver deposits in these hills. If a company found a major vein, they'd want the land, and they'd want it cheap without a bunch of stubborn settlers holding out for fair prices. Hadley's face darkened. "The fever outbreak. You don't think—" "No, the fever was natural. But—" Elias's mind raced, connecting pieces. "But the treatment." Brenner was giving advice to Marsh and Hayes, advice that prolonged the illness rather than curing it. What if he was trying to make things worse? Make the town seem cursed by disease so people would want to leave? "And then there's the Crowley gang," Hadley said grimly. "Hired guns who just happened to be in the area, scouting our town." "That's a hell of a coincidence." Before Elias could respond, a knock came at the door. Dr. Hayes entered, his young face pale and urgent. "Mr. Boone." "Sheriff, you need to come to the infirmary. Dr. Brenner's trying to leave and Dr. Marsh is confronting him." "It's getting heated." They hurried down Main Street, drawing curious looks from townspeople. At the infirmary, they found Dr. Brenner loading his medical bag into his wagon, while Dr. Marsh stood blocking his path. "Elderly but immovable. I don't care what urgent business you claim to have," Marsh was saying, his voice shaking with anger. "You've been treating patients incorrectly on purpose. I've been reviewing your recommendations from the past week. Every single one would have made things worse, not better." "That's preposterous," Brenner snapped. But his eyes were darting, looking for escape routes. "I am a certified physician from Heidelberg. I don't need to justify my medical decisions to a frontier quack." "No, but you'll justify them to me," Hadley said, stepping forward. He held up the letter. "Want to explain your relationship with the Consolidated Western Mining Company, Doctor?" Brenner's face went white. For a moment he seemed frozen, calculating. Then his shoulders sagged in defeat. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "I have debts. Gambling debts back east that I couldn't pay. The company offered me a way out. Come to Silvervale, assess the situation, provide reports. That's all. Just reports. And medical advice designed to drive people away," Elias said, his voice cold. "How many people suffered longer because of your advice? How many might have died?" "No one died. I never intended actual harm. I needed to make the town seem unstable, plague-ridden, a bad investment for settlers but ripe for company acquisition." Brenner looked genuinely distressed. "Miss Carter wasn't supposed to get that sick. The Brennan children, I didn't know they'd deteriorate so fast. I thought your doctors would eventually figure it out, that people would recover with time. I just needed them sick enough, long enough to create doubt." "You took an oath," Dr. Marsh said, his voice breaking. "First, do no harm. You betrayed everything we're supposed to stand for. And the Crowley gang," Hadley pressed. "What's their role in this?" Brenner hesitated, then the words tumbled out. "The company hired them. Not to kill anyone, just to create fear. Raid the town, rough some people up, make it clear that Silvervale isn't safe. Combined with the fever outbreak, it would be enough to convince most settlers to sell their land claims cheap and move on." "When?" Elias demanded. "When are they coming?" Tomorrow at noon. They're supposed to ride in when most people are gathered for the Sunday service. Brenner's voice was barely a whisper. But I swear I told them no killing, just intimidation. Just enough to... He didn't finish. Hadley grabbed him by the collar and hauled him toward the jail, calling for deputies. Dr. Marsh stood in stunned silence, his worldview shattered. Hayes looked like he might be sick. Elias felt a cold rage building in his chest. He'd left civilization behind partly because he'd lost faith in institutions, in the systems that were supposed to protect and heal. And here was proof that his cynicism had been justified. A doctor betraying his oath for money, a company willing to terrify and harm innocent people for profit. But then he looked around. And Dr. Marsh, devastated but still standing, still committed to his principles despite this betrayal. At young Dr. Hayes, his idealism shaken but not broken. At the townspeople beginning to gather, drawn by the commotion. Their faces showing concern for each other rather than panic. This was the difference. Brenner was one corrupt man, but Silvervale was a community, flawed, struggling, but fundamentally decent. Worth protecting, worth fighting for. Lila arrived, having heard the news. She went straight to Elias, reading the fury in his face. "What do we do?" she asked simply. "We prepare," Elias said. "And tomorrow, when the Crowley gang arrives expecting easy prey, we show them what a real community looks like when it stands together." By sunset, the town knew everything. Another meeting was called, but this time the mood was different. Not fear, but righteous anger. These people had carved lives from harsh land. They'd survived winters and fever and isolation. They weren't about to let hired guns and corrupt businessmen drive them away. Plans were refined. Barricades were strengthened. The best marksmen were positioned in the church tower and on the boarding house roof. Women and children were moved to the reinforced cellar under the general store. Every able-bodied man and several determined women armed themselves. Elias found himself at the center of the planning, his military experience invaluable. He organized the defense in depth, early warning scouts, primary defensive positions, fallback points if needed. He trained volunteers in basic tactical concepts, in how to stay calm under fire, in how to protect each other. As darkness fell, he stood with Lila on the porch of the boarding house, looking out at the town preparing for battle. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "For what?" "For all of this. If I'd stayed on my mountain, if I hadn't gotten involved, Thomas Brennan would be dead. I would be dead. And this town would be completely unprepared for what's coming." Lila took his hand, her touch warm and grounding. "You keep apologizing for caring, Elias, but caring isn't weakness. It's the only thing that makes any of this worth fighting for." She was right. He'd spent 14 years trying to not care, trying to protect himself from more loss by refusing to let anyone matter. But standing here, with this woman's hand in his, with a town full of good people preparing to defend their homes, he realized that isolation hadn't protected him. It had just made him half alive. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, "I want you to know..." "Don't." She squeezed his hand. "Don't say goodbye. We're going to win tomorrow. And after we win, you can tell me whatever you want. But not before." He smiled despite everything. "You're a stubborn woman, Miss Carter. And you're a stubborn man, Mr. Boone. We're well matched." They stood together as the stars came out one by one, filling the sky with cold fire. Tomorrow would bring violence and danger. But tonight, they had this moment, this connection, this quiet certainty that whatever came next, they'd face it together. In his pocket, Elias felt the weight of White Owl's medicine pouch. He touched it, remembering the old healer's words about balance, about healing, about the difference between running from pain and moving through it. Tomorrow, he thought, would be a day of reckoning. But tonight, he was exactly where he was supposed to be, home. Dawn came cold and clear, the kind of morning that seemed too beautiful for violence. Elias woke before first light, having barely slept. He dressed carefully, checking his rifle, an old Sharps he'd carried during the war and hadn't fired in over a decade. The weapon was clean and well-maintained, muscle memory from his military days, ensuring he'd kept it functional even when he'd had no intention of using it. The boarding house was stirring early. Eleanor had coffee brewing and breakfast prepared for everyone who'd stayed overnight, the core defense team that would man the primary positions. She moved through the kitchen with determined efficiency, but Elias could see the fear carefully hidden behind her practical exterior. "You'll keep yourself safe?" she asked him quietly, pressing a cup of coffee into his hands. "I'll do my best." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have." He squeezed her shoulder. "We're as ready as we can be, Eleanor. And we're not alone. That counts for something." Dr. Hayes joined him on the porch as the sun cleared the eastern peaks. The young doctor was armed with a hunting rifle that looked too large for his slender frame, but his hands were steady. "I've never shot at a person before," Hayes admitted. "Animals for food, yes. Targets for practice. But a person you shoot to protect," Elias said. "To defend people who can't defend themselves. That's different from killing for sport or revenge." He paused. "But if you can't do it when the moment comes, no one will blame you. Just stay behind cover and help with the wounded. That's where you're most valuable anyway. Is that what you did in the war?" "I was a field medic. But in battle, everyone fights when they have to." Elias checked the sky, judging the time. "The difference is I'd already lost everything I loved. You're young, with your whole life ahead. Don't throw it away trying to be a hero. Aren't you doing exactly that?" Elias smiled grimly. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm finally figuring out what's worth living for." By 9 o'clock, everyone was in position. The scouts had been sent out at dawn, positioned on the roads leading into town, with orders to fire 3 shots if they spotted the gang approaching. Sheriff Hadley coordinated from the church tower, which gave him sight lines down both ends of Main Street. Dr. Marsh had set up a field hospital in the back room of the boarding house, as far from the expected fighting as possible, but close enough to reach wounded quickly. Lila refused to hide in the cellar with the other women and children. Instead, she insisted on helping Marsh prepare medical supplies, bandages torn from clean sheets, instruments boiled and ready, Elias's herbal remedies laid out in careful order. "You're supposed to be recovering," Elias told her when he came to check on the medical station. "I am recovered. Thanks to you." She continued rolling bandages, her movements practiced and efficient. "I'm not going to hide while good people risk their lives defending this town." "Stubborn. We established that already." She looked up at him, and her expression softened. "Be careful out there, please. That's the plan. Plans change." She stood, crossing to him, and before he could react, she kissed him. It was brief, chaste, but filled with unspoken promises. "For luck," she said. "And to remind you that you have something to come back for." Elias touched her face gently. "I'll remember." He took his position on the boarding house roof with 2 other men, the blacksmith, a quiet man named Garrett, and a homesteader called Jensen, who'd fought at Shiloh. From here, they could cover most of Main Street and provide supporting fire for Hadley's position at the church. The waiting was the hardest part. Minutes crawled by like hours. The sun climbed higher, warming the air enough that Elias shed his heavy coat. Below, the town was eerily quiet, a ghost settlement except for the armed men hidden in windows and behind barricades. 11 o'clock came and went. Elias began to wonder if Brenner had lied, if the gang wasn't coming after all. Maybe they'd heard about the arrest, or gotten spooked, or simply decided Silvervale wasn't worth the trouble. Then, at 15 minutes before noon, 3 shots echoed from the northern approach. "The warning! Here we go," Jensen muttered, checking his rifle. Elias's military training kicked in, that strange clarity that came before combat. His breathing steadied. His hands were rock solid on his rifle. Fear didn't disappear, but it channeled into focus, into readiness. They heard the horses before they saw them, 5 riders approaching at a confident pace. The Crowley gang rode into town like they owned it, spread across Main Street, rifles held casually but ready. They were hard-looking men, weathered by violence and bad choices, the kind who'd chosen to take rather than build. Jack Crowley rode in the center, a big man with a scarred face and cold eyes. He reined in his horse at the center of town, looking around at the seemingly empty buildings. "Citizens of Silvervale," he called out, his voice carrying. "We don't want trouble. But we represent the Consolidated Western Mining Company, and they have legitimate claim to this land. You've got 1 hour to start packing your belongings. Anyone still here come sunset will be encouraged to leave in ways you won't enjoy." Silence answered him. Crowley frowned. "I know you can hear me. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Sheriff Hadley's voice rang out from the church tower. "You're the ones making it hard, Crowley. We know your hired guns. We know about the mining company's scheme. And we know Dr. Brenner's in our jail, singing like a canary." The gang members exchanged glances. Crowley's jaw tightened. "Then you know we're getting paid either way," he said. "Whether you leave peaceful or leave bleeding makes no difference to us." "It makes a difference to us," Hadley replied. "This is our home, and we're not leaving." Elias watched as Crowley's expression hardened. This wasn't how the outlaw had expected this to go. He'd been counting on fear, on the town being disorganized and demoralized. Instead, he was facing organized resistance. "Your choice," Crowley said, and reached for his rifle. What happened next unfolded in the strange, slow motion that Elias remembered from the war. Crowley's rifle came up, aimed at the church tower. Hadley fired first, the shot cracking through the morning air. Crowley jerked back, hit in the shoulder, and then all hell broke loose. The gang scattered, their horses panicking as gunfire erupted from multiple positions. One outlaw went down immediately, shot from the general store window. Another dismounted and took cover behind a water trough, returning fire wildly. Elias sighted carefully and fired. His bullet hit the trough inches from the outlaw's head, forcing him to duck lower. Beside him, Jensen and Garrett were firing in controlled bursts, years of hunting making them steady under pressure. The battle dissolved into chaos, smoke, noise, the smell of gunpowder sharp in the air. Crowley's horse bolted, leaving him stumbling for cover, blood streaming from his shoulder. 2 of his men had taken positions behind the overturned wagons they'd prepared as barricades, creating a standoff. "They're pinned, but not beaten," Jensen observed. "We need to flank them. Too exposed," Elias said. "We wait. They're 5 against a whole town. Time is on our side." But even as he said it, he saw one of the outlaws pull something from his saddlebag, a bottle with a rag stuffed in the neck. A Molotov cocktail, crude but effective. "Firebomb!" Elias shouted the warning as the man lit it and hurled it toward the schoolhouse. The bottle shattered against the wall, and flames erupted, licking at the dry wood. Leela's school, the place she'd poured her heart into, the symbol of the town's future. It was burning. Without thinking, Elias was moving, scrambling down from the roof. He heard Lila screaming, saw her running toward the school, despite Dr. Marsh trying to hold her back. The fire was spreading fast, and inside were all the books, the children's work, everything she'd built. "Elias, no." Hadley's voice from the tower. But Elias was already running, sprinting across the open street toward the school. Bullets kicked up dust around him. One tugged at his sleeve, another grazed his leg, but he didn't stop. He reached the school and kicked in the door, smoke billowing out. The heat was intense, flames climbing the walls, consuming everything. He plunged inside, grabbing what he could, books, the children's drawings, the brass bell that Lila rang every morning. His lungs burned, his eyes streamed tears, but he kept moving, gathering armfuls of materials and throwing them out the window away from the flames. A beam cracked overhead. Elias looked up and saw the roof beginning to collapse. Time to go. He grabbed one last armload, including a slate with a child's careful letters on it, and dove through the door as the roof came down behind him. Showering sparks and burning timber, strong hands pulled him away from the inferno. Garrett and Jensen, having abandoned their position to help, they dragged him to cover as bullets continued to fly, the Crowley gang taking advantage of the distraction to press their attack. "You crazy son of a—" Jensen was laughing and cursing simultaneously. "That was the stupidest, bravest thing I've ever seen." Elias coughed, his lungs full of smoke, but he was grinning. In his arms were pieces of Lila's school, saved from destruction. Not everything, but enough. Enough to rebuild from. Lila reached him, tears streaming down her face, and pulled him into an embrace that felt like coming home. "Don't you ever do that again," she sobbed. "Don't you dare!" "Had to," he rasped. "Couldn't let them destroy what you built." A bullet struck the ground near them, spraying dirt. The battle wasn't over. Crowley and his remaining men were still fighting, desperate now, cornered and dangerous. "Get her to safety," Elias told Garrett. "Marsh needs her at the medical station. What about you?" Elias picked up his rifle, his hands black with soot, his leg bleeding but functional. "I'm ending this." He moved with purpose, circling wide through the buildings, using every bit of tactical knowledge he'd gained in the war. The outlaws were focused on the frontal assault, on the defenders they could see. They weren't watching their flanks. Elias came up behind their position, rifle raised. He could see Crowley, wounded and enraged, directing his men. Could see the desperation in their movements, the realization that this wasn't going the way they'd planned. "It's over, Crowley." Elias called out. The outlaw spun, reaching for his gun. Elias fired, not to kill, but to disarm. The bullet hit Crowley's gun hand, sending his weapon flying. The other outlaws froze, seeing themselves surrounded now, caught between Elias behind them and the town's defenders in front. "Drop your weapons," Sheriff Hadley commanded from the church tower. "You're done." For a moment it could have gone either way. Then one by one, the surviving gang members raised their hands in surrender. The battle for Silvervale was over. But as Elias looked at the burning schoolhouse, at the wounded townspeople being carried to Dr. Marsh's station, at Lila's tear-stained face, he knew the real work was just beginning. They'd won the fight. Now they had to heal the wounds, both physical and otherwise, and figure out how to move forward, together. The aftermath of battle was always worse than the battle itself. Elias had learned that in the war, and nothing about Silvervale changed that truth. 3 townspeople had been wounded, none critically, thank God, but all needing immediate care. Jensen had taken a bullet through his calf. A young man named Peter had been grazed across the ribs. And old Mrs. Henderson, who'd insisted on loading rifles from the general store window, had been struck by flying splinters when a bullet shattered the window frame, leaving dozens of wooden needles embedded in her arm and shoulder. Of the Crowley gang, 2 were dead. 1 was badly wounded, and the remaining 3, including Jack Crowley himself, were injured but mobile. Now secured in Sheriff Hadley's jail under armed guard, Elias worked through the afternoon, moving between patients with Dr. Marsh and Dr. Hayes. His hands were steady despite exhaustion, his mind clear despite the smoke he'd inhaled. This was what he'd been trained for, what he was good at, putting broken bodies back together, stopping bleeding, administering pain relief, offering comfort to the frightened and hurt. Jensen bore his treatment with stoic humor, joking about having a story to tell his grandchildren. Peter was young and scared, needing reassurance more than medicine. But Mrs. Henderson presented the real challenge. The splinters had to be removed one by one. A painstaking process that required patience and precision. "This is going to hurt," Elias warned her, preparing his tools. "I've birthed 6 children and buried 3, Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "I can handle a few splinters." She didn't make a sound during the entire procedure, though Elias saw the tears running down her weathered cheeks. When he finished cleaning and bandaging the wounds, she patted his hand with her good one. "You're a good man, Elias Boone," she said. "Don't let anyone tell you different." Outside, the schoolhouse still smoldered. The town had formed a bucket brigade to keep the fire from spreading to neighboring buildings, but there was no saving the school itself. It was a total loss. Walls blackened, roof collapsed, everything inside reduced to ash and memory, except for what Elias had saved. Those armloads of books and drawings and materials sat in a pile by the boarding house, smoke-damaged but intact. A small victory, but victory nonetheless. Lila knelt beside the pile, going through the salvaged items with trembling hands. She picked up the brass bell, dented now, tarnished by heat and smoke, but still whole. She rang it once, and the sound was cracked, damaged, but still recognizable. Still the same bell that had called children to learning, that had marked the rhythm of the town's days. "We can rebuild," Eleanor said, standing beside her. "The men will help. We'll have a new school by spring. It won't be the same." "No, it'll be better," Eleanor's voice was firm. Because it'll be a school that we fought for, that we refuse to let them take from us. Elias approached them, his medical work done for the moment. His leg throbbed where the bullet had grazed him, and his lungs still burned from the smoke, but he was functional. He'd been hurt worse. How are the wounded? Lila asked. They'll all recover. Jensen will limp for a while, but he'll keep the leg. Mrs. Henderson's arm will be sore, but no permanent damage. Peter just needs time and rest. Elias looked at the ruined school. I'm sorry I couldn't save more. You saved what mattered most. Lila held up a child's drawing, a crude but enthusiastic sketch of a house with a family standing in front. And you saved yourself. That matters most of all. Sheriff Hadley joined them, his face grim. Crowley's talking. Seems real eager to cooperate, now that he's facing territorial justice instead of mining company protection. What's he saying? The mining company's larger than we thought. Consolidated Western has stakes in 6 territories, and they've used similar tactics before. Hire local troublemakers to drive out settlers, buy up the land cheap, then extract whatever resources they find. They've done it in Colorado, Montana, even up in the Dakota Territory. Can we stop them? Eleanor asked, with Brenner and Crowley's testimony. Maybe. I've already sent word to the territorial marshal. But these things take time, and companies like this have lawyers and politicians in their pockets. Hadley's expression was hard. We won today's battle. The war might be longer. Then we fight the war, Lila said simply. Whatever it takes. Elias looked at her, this woman who'd been on death's door just days ago, who'd watched her school burn, who had every reason to give up or run. Instead, she stood tall, determined, ready to fight for what mattered. He'd spent 14 years running from exactly this kind of commitment, this kind of risk. Convinced that caring about anything meant opening himself up to loss, to pain. But standing here, surrounded by people who'd fought for their home, who'd bled for each other, who refused to let greed and violence win, he realized that the real cowardice wasn't in loving and losing. It was in never loving at all. We fight together, he said, and meant it. Lila's hand found his, their fingers intertwining naturally, and for the first time since Catherine and Rose died, Elias Boone allowed himself to believe in a future that included more than just survival. He believed in possibility. The sun was setting, painting the valley in shades of amber and rose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, rebuilding, legal battles, the long process of healing both physical and emotional wounds. But tonight they had this, a community that had stood together and won, a community he was part of, a place he could finally, honestly call home. The evening brought more revelations as Crowley continued talking, desperate to reduce his sentence. He revealed that the mining company had targeted at least 4 other settlements in the territory with similar schemes. Some had succeeded. Entire towns abandoned, land acquired for pennies on the dollar, residents scattered to the winds. Others had failed when communities fought back, or when local law enforcement proved less corruptible than expected. We were supposed to be easy, Crowley admitted from his cell. Hadley and Elias standing outside the bars. Small town, recent fever outbreak, no real law enforcement to speak of. Brenner said you'd fold quick, especially if we hit hard and fast. He underestimated us, Hadley said. He underestimated a lot of things. Crowley looked at Elias with something like grudging respect. When Brenner described you, he made you sound like some crazy hermit who'd run at the first sign of trouble. He didn't mention you were a soldier, or that you'd organize the whole damn town like a military unit. I'm not a soldier anymore. Could have fooled me today. Crowley winced, his wounded shoulder clearly paining him. For what it's worth, I'm glad you stopped us. This wasn't supposed to be my life, hired gun, terrorizing decent folks. But after the war, after everything I'd seen and done, it seemed like the only option left. Elias understood that sentiment more than he wanted to admit. How many times had he told himself that isolation was his only option? That he was too broken, too damaged, too marked by loss to be part of anything good? It's never the only option, Elias said quietly. But sometimes it takes hitting bottom to realize that. After leaving the jail, Elias made his rounds, checking on the wounded one final time before allowing himself to rest. Jensen was sleeping peacefully, his leg properly splinted and bandaged. Mrs. Henderson was sitting up, telling the story of the battle to her visiting daughter with embellishments that made Elias smile. Peter was young and resilient, already talking about getting back to work at the smithy. At the boarding house, Eleanor had prepared a meal that felt almost festive, despite the day's violence. The core defenders gathered around her table: Hadley, Dr. Marsh, Dr. Hayes, Garrett the blacksmith, several other townsmen who'd fought, and Lila. They ate and talked, the conversation mixing relief with exhaustion. Triumph with sorrow for what had been lost. To Silver Vale, Hadley said, raising his glass. And to the stubborn fools who refused to let anyone take it from us. They drank to that. And then someone started singing, one of those frontier songs that everyone knew, about hardship and perseverance and refusing to quit. Other voices joined in, rough and off-key but heartfelt. Elias found himself singing too, his voice rusty from disuse but growing stronger with each verse. He couldn't remember the last time he'd sung. Couldn't remember the last time he'd felt part of something larger than himself. When the meal ended and people began drifting away to their homes, Lila pulled Elias aside. "Walk with me," she asked. They walked through the town as stars began appearing overhead. The street was quiet now, the barricades still in place, but the immediate danger past. They reached what remained of the schoolhouse, still radiating heat, the smell of charred wood heavy in the air. "I keep thinking about what we lost," Lila said. "All those books, the children's work from the whole year, the desk where little Emma finally learned to read, the map of the United States that Mr. Peterson painted on the wall. I'm sorry I couldn't save more. You saved." "Enough." She touched the locket at her throat, the one that had stopped the bullet days ago. "You have a habit of saving things, Elias Boone, saving people. I've failed at it more times than I've succeeded. So have we all. But you keep trying. That's what matters." She turned to face him fully. "I know you're planning to leave. Once the immediate crisis passes, once you're sure the town is safe. You'll go back to your mountain. Lila, let me finish." Her voice was gentle but firm. "I don't blame you if you do. You have your reasons, your grief, your need for solitude. I understand that, but I want you to know," she paused, choosing her words carefully. "I want you to know that there's a place for you here. Not just as a doctor, though God knows we need one, but as a person, as someone who belongs. I don't know if I remember how to belong. Neither did I when I first came west, but you figure it out. Day by day, person by person." She took his hand. "I'm not asking for promises. I'm not asking you to decide right now. I'm just asking you to consider that maybe, just maybe, you've spent long enough running from life. Maybe it's time to run toward it instead." Elias looked at her face in the starlight, this woman who'd been saved by his medicine, who'd stood beside him during battle, who offered him something he'd thought impossible. Not just romance, though he felt that pull, but redemption, purpose, a second chance at the life he'd abandoned. "I killed men today," he said, voicing the thought that had been haunting him. "I took up arms, and I hurt people, and part of me didn't hesitate. Part of me wanted to. You protected people. There's a difference." "Is there?" "White Owl taught me that healing and harming are two sides of the same coin, that the knowledge that saves can also destroy. Today I chose destruction. Today you chose defense. You chose protection. You chose community over isolation." Lila squeezed his hand. "And then, as soon as the fighting ended, you went right back to healing. That's who you are, Elias, not a killer. A healer who was forced to fight. He wanted to believe her, wanted to accept the absolution she offered. But years of self-recrimination, of carrying guilt like a stone in his chest, made it hard. They stood in silence, the ruined school behind them, the living town around them. Finally, Elias spoke. "I'll stay," he said. "At least through the winter. Help rebuild the school. Make sure the fever doesn't return. Testify against the mining company if needed." He met her eyes. "After that, we'll see. It wasn't a commitment to forever. But it was a commitment to now, to here, to her." And from the way Lila smiled, radiant despite exhaustion, hopeful despite loss, "It was enough. That's all I ask," she said. They walked back to the boarding house together, and Elias realized something fundamental had shifted inside him. The walls he'd built around his heart hadn't crumbled, walls built from grief that deep didn't disappear overnight. But they'd developed cracks, windows, doors, ways for light to get in, ways for life to return. Spring came to Silvervale with the patience of something earned rather than given. The winter had been long and hard, but the town had weathered it together, rebuilding, healing, growing stronger in the places where it had been broken. The new schoolhouse stood where the old one had burned, built from fresh-cut pine that still smelled of sap and promise. It was larger than before, with a better stove, more windows, and shelves that could hold twice as many books. The town had come together for the construction, everyone contributing what they could: labor, materials, expertise, time. On the day they hung the new school bell, donated by the territorial governor after hearing about Silvervale's stand against the mining company, the whole town gathered to celebrate. The bell was brass, polished to a brilliant shine, larger and clearer toned than the old one. But before they mounted the new bell, Lila asked for the old one to be displayed beside the door, dented and tarnished, a reminder of what they'd survived. Elias stood beside her as she rang the new bell for the first time. The sound echoed across the valley, bright and hopeful, and children cheered while adults applauded. "It's perfect," Lila said, her eyes shining with tears she didn't bother to hide. "You're perfect," Elias replied quietly, earning him a smile that warmed him more than any spring sun. The territorial marshal had come in February, taking Crowley and his surviving gang members to trial. Dr. Brenner had been tried separately, stripped of his medical license, and sentenced to 5 years for conspiracy and fraud. The mining company had fought hard, but with testimony from multiple towns and documentation of their schemes, they'd been forced to withdraw from the territory entirely. It wasn't perfect justice. Some of the company officials escaped prosecution, but it was enough. More importantly, it sent a message. Frontier towns might be small, but they weren't defenseless. Elias had stayed through it all, testifying when needed, treating patients, teaching Dr. Hayes everything he knew about combining traditional medicine with wilderness remedies. What had started as staying through winter had become something more permanent, though he and Lila never discussed it explicitly. It was understood in the small ways. The cabin he'd started building at the edge of town, close enough to respond to emergencies, but far enough for the solitude he sometimes needed. The way his belongings slowly migrated from the boarding house to a room that was becoming his. The way people had stopped calling him the Hermit and started calling him Doc Boone. Dr. Marsh had officially retired in March, passing his practice to Elias with a handshake and a gruff warning to not let the bastards grind you down. Dr. Hayes had stayed on as well, setting up a partnership that combined his formal training with Elias's practical experience. Together, they'd treated everything from childbirth to broken bones, from fever to the simple need for someone to listen. On a warm April morning, Elias rode up to Devil's Ridge one last time. Not to stay, but to close that chapter properly. His old cabin stood as he'd left it, weathered, isolated, a monument to years of running. He went inside and gathered the last of his belongings: White Owl's journal, Catherine and Rose's daguerreotype, a few tools and keepsakes that still held meaning. He stood in the doorway one final time, looking out at the view he'd woken to for 14 years. The mountains were beautiful, eternal, indifferent. They'd sheltered him when he needed shelter, but they'd also imprisoned him in solitude. "Thank you," he said to the empty air, to White Owl's ghost, to the land itself. "But it's time to go home." He locked the cabin door and rode back down to Silvervale, where life waited. That evening he found Lila sitting on the steps of the new school, watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and crimson. She'd been working late, preparing lessons for the next week, and looked tired but content. "I closed up the ridge cabin," he said, settling beside her. "For good? For now. Maybe I'll go back sometimes, gather herbs, remember what White Owl taught me." But I won't be living there, he paused. If that's all right with you, why would it need to be all right with me? Because I'm hoping... He pulled out a small object from his pocket. It was a ring, simple and handmade, crafted from silver he'd traded for with work at the smithy. I'm hoping you might consider making this arrangement more permanent. Lila stared at the ring, then at him, her eyes wide. Elias Boone, are you proposing to me? I am. If you'll have me. He took her hand gently. I know I'm not an easy man. I know I still carry ghosts and grief. I know there will be days when I'm difficult, when the past weighs too heavy, when I need space and silence. But I also know that I love you, that you've given me a reason to live instead of just survive, that whatever time I have left, I want to spend it with you. Tears rolled down Lila's cheeks. You stubborn, wonderful, impossible man. Of course I'll marry you. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and they kissed as the sun set behind the mountains, as the town bustled with evening sounds around them, as life, messy, complicated, beautiful life, continued its eternal dance. 6 weeks later, on a June morning bright with promise, Reverend Pine married them in the new schoolhouse surrounded by the entire town. Eleanor Gibbs wept openly. Sheriff Hadley served as best man, looking uncomfortable in his formal vest. The children sang, slightly off-key but enthusiastic, after the ceremony. As they walked back toward the boarding house for the celebration Eleanor had insisted on preparing. Lila suddenly stopped. Listen, she said. Elias listened. He heard children playing, adults talking and laughing, the blacksmith's hammer ringing in the distance, birds singing in the cottonwoods, the eternal whisper of wind through the valley. What am I listening for? He asked. Life, Lila said simply. Just life. Isn't it beautiful? And standing there with his wife's hand in his, with a community around him, with purpose and connection and hope, filling spaces that had been empty for so long, Elias Boone smiled. Yes, he said. It really is. Months later, when autumn painted the mountains in fire and gold, Lila stood at the school door, one hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly, and rang the bell that called the children to learning. The sound carried across the valley, mixing with wood smoke and the smell of coming winter, with the sounds of a town going about its daily business. Inside the schoolhouse, Elias was teaching a class on plants and healing, showing the children how to identify yarrow and bee plant, how to prepare simple remedies, how to respect the land that provided. Young faces watched him with rapt attention, asking questions, absorbing knowledge that might save lives someday. When the lesson ended and the children rushed out to recess, Lila slipped her hand into his. Happy? She asked. Elias looked around the schoolroom they'd built together, thought about the life growing inside her, remembered the long journey from grief to healing, from isolation to connection. He pulled out his old medical journal and opened it to a fresh page. In careful script he wrote, "The mountain taught me to survive. This town taught me to live again. And this woman taught me that healing begins when we stop running from love." He showed her the entry, and she smiled through happy tears. "That's beautiful," she said. "That's true," he corrected. "And truth is all I have left to give." They stood together at the window, watching the children play under the vast Wyoming sky. And Elias Boone, once a hermit, once a man drowning in grief, once convinced he had nothing left to offer, felt something he hadn't felt in 14 long years. He felt complete. Outside, the school bell stood silent now, waiting for tomorrow's call to learning. Beside it hung the old bell, scarred and dented, bearing witness to battles fought and won, to losses survived and overcome. The mountains stood eternal in the distance, and somewhere up there, Elias imagined White Owl's spirit nodding approval. The earth had its cures, as the old healer had promised. But the greatest cure of all, Elias had learned, wasn't found in plants or medicine. It was found in choosing to live again, in opening your heart despite the risk, in believing that even after profound loss, there could be profound joy. The wind carried his thoughts up to the high country, where he'd hidden for so long, then brought them back down to the valley where he belonged, where life in all its messy, complicated, Beautiful glory continued its eternal dance, and Elias Boone danced with it. No longer a ghost, no longer running, finally and completely home.